This section of the course considers how we can apply social psychology theory to help improve intergroup relations and other kinds of conflict that we encounter in the world. And we're going to look in this lecture at how we can apply social identity theory to social change project. What does social identity theory say about social change? So we've considered some of the effects of social identification. So let me move my picture there. The two layers of effects. So as soon as we move from the individual to the social side of that individual social identification continuum, there are changes that happen to our own self-perceptions, our own self-stereotyping, our feelings of self-worth, our self-esteem, etc. And of course there are also societal effects. So groups start forming. There's a possibility of mobilizing, of collective action. All these are the effects of this shift in identification. And you'll recall that it's a fluid process. Situational salience can prime certain forms of identification. Of course, leaders, people giving speeches, political leaders, etc., student leaders can produce social identification, a kind of convergence in social identification. So social identification theory is, according to Mick Billig, a theory of group freedom. It explains how oppressed groups can find ways to challenge power, to challenge the oppressed state in society. And so there we're going to look at how does social identification lead to social change and challenge to unjust social status hierarchies. Well, I've already preempted here why is social change necessary? Well, precisely because we live in a world of inequality where social groups are arranged hierarchically. And of course, we all want to be at the top, in the most favored group, in the privileged group, the advantaged group, but very often we find ourselves in disadvantaged groups. And as we've learned in the course, this has negative social psychological consequences for us. So who would you prefer to be in the organization? The manager, the accountant, or the programmers, or you might even go lower down, the cleaners. And so our social world is arranged like this with injustices in those social hierarchies. And that there is the point of social change. How can we create a fairer world? So according to Tajfel, he was very interested in minorities and powerless groups and how they can effect change. And he argues that minorities only have a limited number of psychological solutions to the problem of negative identity. What is it possible to do? And the kind of solution is related to the conditions under which the minorities live. So social identity theory is often called the macro theory. There's broader aspects. Social identity theory focuses, as you've seen, on categorization, social comparison, a lot of cognitive aspects. But in this part of social identity theory, Tajfel turns his attention to the social world and social conditions under which we form our identity. And one of those conditions that we've considered is hierarchy that can create a sense of injustice. So what can you do to fix the situation as a member of a stigmatized group? Look at this famous quote here from Erving Goffman in his book Stigma, and he's talking about ex-cons. I always feel this way with straight people. This is what an ex-convict says. You imagine coming out of prison. You've got a whole lot of tattoos all over your body, over your face, etc. Everyone can see you're an ex-convict. And this convict says, I feel whenever they're being nice to me all the time, they're only assessing me as a criminal and nothing else. It's too late for me. You see, I still feel this keenly. They're incapable of accepting me as anything else. What can you do to change your situation where you're an ex-convict? How can you get a higher status? And what Tajfel argues, that change depends on the social conditions in which we live. Of course, what could this ex-convict do? Could try and wear a shirt up, button up, try and cover over the tattoos, try and pretend that he wasn't an ex-convict. So here are the social strategies. You remember the quote from Tajfel? Members of minorities have a limited number of psychological solutions to the problem of negative identification. When you're on the low status group, you've got negative identification. And he argues that the kind of solution is closely tied to the conditions. And so there we are. Here on the left are the psychological responses that we're going to consider in this lecture. There are 3 psychological solutions. The one is mobility, the second is creativity, and the third is competition. And these are the social conditions that regulate whether we're going to engage in social mobility, creativity, or competition. Permeability and legitimacy. And we're going to consider each of these conditions in turn. So this slide provides an overview of this macro theory, the social identity theory, macro theory. So social conditions for change. Firstly, there we're dealing with status inequality. That is the fact that social groups are arranged in hierarchies. The second condition we're concerned with is boundary permeability. Is it easy to pass from one group and to become a member of another group? Can you change your group? Some groups are very difficult to change. Gender groups have historically been difficult. Even today, men do change from women and women change to become men, but it is not an easy process to do. Of course, if you want to give up the soccer team you support and support another soccer team, it's a much easier thing to do. There can also be huge pressures if you want to change from one church to another church. There might be a lot of difficulty involved in leaving one and joining another. So boundary permeability essentially means how easy is it to exit one group and to enter into another. Are the boundaries between the groups permeable or impermeable? The third condition we're going to look at there is legitimacy. Are there cognitive alternatives to the situation? Is the hierarchy, this hierarchy stable and legitimate, or unstable and illegitimate? Can we reimagine a different form of status hierarchy? So say, for example, in hospital, who's got the higher status? In the mental hospital, the psychiatrists or the mental patients? Well, clearly the psychiatrists have much more authority and status than the mental patients, and it's unlikely that the mental patients are going to take over the psychiatric hospital, and it's going to reverse, and the psychiatrists are going to be the inmates in that institution, because the social status hierarchy there is stable and legitimate. And the same is true of prisoners and guards. It's unlikely that the prisoners are going to take over and the guards are going to be, the guards have got legitimacy and status institutionally given by the state. If you take a look, for example, at the relations between men and women, men have historically been the dominant group in that hierarchy, but you can see that the legitimacy of that hierarchy is highly contested in the world today. And the same is true in terms of race. I mean, in the history of colonialism, there was a hierarchy, a racial hierarchy that's been instituted, and essentially what decolonization has done has questioned and contested the legitimacy and the stability of that hierarchy, and it's under huge flux and change at the moment. So those are our social conditions: inequality, status hierarchy, boundary permeability, and legitimacy. So here are our strategies now. What can we do? The one strategy that we can use, a social change strategy, is social mobility. If the group boundaries are permeable, we can exit the one group and try and enter into the poor. So you can think of a poor university student from a poor background working hard at university, getting top grades, looking to get an executive position, to exit the group of the poor and to become a member of the group of the rich. And those aspirations are something that capitalism has promoted, this idea of social mobility, that if we work hard, it doesn't matter where we come from, we can move up the social status hierarchy. So we can see that according to Tarschfeld, you remember this continuum that we dealt with, individual identity and social identity on the one side, and the social mobility versus social change distinction mirrors this. On this side over here, we've got individual identity, where you exit your group, you assimilate into another group. You might pass for a member of that other group. This is an individual response that leaves the social order unchanged. So this, what Tajfel is arguing on this side of these strategies, the individual mobility, the individual identity, when it's all about you, I'm going to leave my poor group and become a member of the rich group over here. It leaves the hierarchy intact, it's unchanged. And it's just individuals that try and exit and move up the ladder of success, as it were, to change group membership. But the injustice of the social order remains. And so Tajfel and Billig and others were very much interested in this side over here, the social change side, and in social identity. How can we produce social identities that can produce change to unjust social systems? So here you'll notice on the social change side, the two different strategies. There's a social creativity strategy and there's a social competition strategy. And we're going to look at each of those in turn. So this over here is social creativity. We engage in social creativity when the status hierarchy appears stable and legitimate, that there's nothing we can really do about it. It's going to, so we have to use psychological solutions to the negative status. And this is it's a very common way of doing this over here, is just to change the category of comparison. If you're comparing yourself continually to high status groups, and you're always feeling negative comparisons, the solution to that is, instead of comparing yourself to high status groups, compare yourself to low status groups. So if you're an accountant in a firm, rather than comparing yourself to managers and thinking like, oh, we're doing so badly, they've got all the luxury cars, they live in those posh neighborhoods, etc., they can rather compare themselves to the programs and thinking, sure, we're actually doing quite well over here. We've got the better cars and we're living in the better neighborhoods, our kids are going to better schools. And so the first social creativity strategy is just to change the category of comparison. Okay, there we are. At least we're better than the programmers. So here we are. The second social creativity strategy is to select a new dimension of comparison. So this is, I've got to use the illustration here of masculinity. Who's the man? Who's the best man that there is? If you want to feel good about yourself as a man, your masculinity, how do you construct yourself? Well, one category of success is wealth. I'm the richest. Another category of success might be in terms of fame. I'm the most famous. Another category of success is I've got the toughest body. And of course, each one of these men are able to make favorable comparisons when they compare themselves to the other by using different dimensions of comparison. Toughness versus wealth versus fame. So that there is a social creativity strategy 2. Here, social creativity strategy 3 is redefining the value of a dimension. So in our society, wealth is often used as a value. The richer you are, the better you are. But we can reject that. It's possible to reject this. This is a hippie, for example, I've got over here, a sort of earth activist. These people, the wealth, the pursuit of money is destroying our environment. It's killing our planet. You can reject the dimension that seems to have so much value, and you can create alternative sense of value and alternative dimensions of what is valuable. So the thing about these strategies focus on groups. You'll notice we're comparing this group to that group, or the dimension of comparison changes. The earlier strategy, the social mobility strategy, focused on individuals. You leave the group, you join the other group. So this social creativity is a way of contesting which group is actually the most powerful or the most that to be aspired to. So in our social change side of this continuum, you remember here's an individual side, the social mobility, here's the social change side. We've got two different strategies. We've got a social creativity strategy that we've just considered, and then there's a social competition strategy. So what determines whether group members engage in social creativity or in social competition? And that is essentially, are there cognitive alternatives? Is the system legitimate and stable, or is it illegitimate and unstable? Now, I've used the traffic officer versus the car guard to illustrate what I mean by legitimacy and stability. So who has legitimacy here to set the rules? The car guard has no legitimacy at all. You can pay the car guard or you don't pay the car guard, whoever. You can even just see the car guard is unofficial. How, in contrast, the traffic officer has lots of legitimacy. There's legitimacy given by the state, has a uniform, has a weapon. So there's lots of legitimacy and power in the traffic officer. Now, the same thing can happen in social systems. Social systems can have lots of legitimacy. They can look, the authorities and the rules and everything can look like a traffic officer. And of course, governments themselves are armed with the police and the military. Or else the government can start looking like the car guard, lacking legitimacy, and looking like it's just pretending to be ruling, but it has no legitimacy and it can be contested. And that's what happens in the situation of social competition. That what seemed before to have legitimacy is now seen to be illegitimate and stable and open to change. And we can see so many examples of social competition throughout history. Think of the women's movement. Women were uneducated, they never went to school, they weren't sent to schools, they had no right to vote. I think it was in Switzerland in 1974, it's recently 74, that women were given the right to vote. And of course, that distinction between men and women and the hierarchy between them, especially from the second half of the 20th century with the suffragettes, women's movements of various kinds, feminism has competed to upend that dominance that men enjoyed in earlier times. So under certain conditions, as soon as the social systems seems illegitimate and it's made to appear illegitimate, you think the dominance of men looks like the traffic officer, but it's actually just the car guard, that genuine social change becomes possible. And this has had a great impact in the history of the liberation movement in South Africa. If you've never read this book, Steve Biko, Write What I Like, I strongly recommend it. Steve Biko actually was at University of KwaZulu-Natal Medical School as a student, and he became very famous for his political speeches, and essentially he was writing in a time when the apartheid system seemed to be like the traffic officer, seemed to have a lot of legitimacy. And what Biko was arguing is that what African people needed to do was to view the apartheid system as a car guard. It lacked legitimacy. To change their perception of the social world, and this would be a way in which they could then contest and change the social hierarchy. So the creation of cognitive alternatives. There's two quotes from Steve Biko, very famous for saying that the instrument of oppression in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. That was Biko's first words, or famous words. And essentially what he's arguing is a social psychological change, as you can see in those quotes, to produce the conditions of social competition. So here's an overview. We can say an overview of the macro theory of social identity theory. How does social identity theory inform social change? Well, just summarizing what we've said over here, this is the individual side of a belief system, individual mobility. There's nothing we can do about the groups, and all we're going to do is we're going to exit our low status group. We're going to work ourselves up to the top. So the strategy is an individual mobility strategy. We work to join the high status group. What this strategy does over here, it leaves the status hierarchy intact. No social change, just individuals try and seek change. It's ideological. That's what capitalism promotes. It tells everyone, work hard, you can get to the top, but actually these systems remain deeply entrenched systems of inequality. On the group side, we've got the social change side of this belief system. If there's no cognitive alternatives, In other words, the social order looks like a policeman, a traffic officer over there. Then we have to engage in social creativity activity. We change the dimension of our comparison. We redefine the dimensions, etc. Also, the social order doesn't change. It's only over here when we create the psychological conditions, this idea that the social order is unstable, it's illegitimate, that it produces direct challenge to the social order. So the conclusions. The group is not just a collection of individuals. I think that's one thing that's clear from social identity theory. It's a psychological condition, it's a psychological state, the belief, it's a self-categorization. And this self-categorization that people have and the views that they have of the social world are consequential for history, for social change, etc. Groups are in competition for relative status. Groups are ordered in a social status hierarchy and they're competing with each other. When you're at the top, it's great. When you're at the bottom, it's not so great. So group identity in these interactions is happening in society structure our world. The South Africa we live in now, the world that we live in now, is the outcome of a history of group struggles. And of course the system is in constant change. And that there's also, we have to think about how can we change the system? How should we change the system? So we can create more just worlds in the future. And then a final take home of if you can change social identity, you can change the world. And that's quite an interesting, that's what Tajfel was so excited about. That was the idea that informed his work. We can change the world, and the point of intervention is social identification.